Everybody. I'm David Levy. I'm Dean of the Duke Law School. It wasn't so very long ago that Kevin White, Vice President and Athletics Director at Duke, the two of us went to a little neighborhood pizza place, and we talked about what could we do together, our two hearts of Duke. We have such wonderful athletics at Duke, and at the same time, we have a law school that has a tremendous faculty that is interested in sports law. We have Paul Haagen and John Wiestart and Dorianne Coleman and Jim Coleman, and their work is engaged with sport and the law. And it didn't take too long before Kevin said, you know, we should do a program on the internationalization of league sports. And that brings us to tonight. And here we are at Weil Gotshal, thanks to Jeff Tabak, our Duke Law graduate. Thank you, Jeff. So just as we get started, thank you very much to our distinguished panel. Professor Haagen, thank you for putting this together. He will introduce our panel. We have at least one trustee here and perhaps others. Peter Kahn, the head of my board. David Eichel is here with wife Jan. Richard Riddell is here on behalf of himself, but also President Dick Broadhead. And Kevin, thank you very much for doing this with us. And of course, Jay Bilas. You're the man. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Paul.
This is an event that I'm very excited about. For at least 10 years, I've been wanting to get a Center for the Study of Sport and intersection of sport and law started at Duke. And now I have a dean who thinks that's a good idea, and so it's finally coming together. The panel is just a magnificent panel, and it represents a couple of things that I am hoping as a collective to show. We have 4 lawyers up there, and although a number of them claimed not to be lawyers when I tried to foist that on them, I'm insisting that this is a sign of the centrality of law and its place in sport. We have a couple of Dukies who have gravitated to that end of the table, and to show that we're also a group that embraces others, we have Jim Tanner from Carolina and Tim Brosnan. You're Georgetown.
Georgetown undergrad.
Yeah, so you know, we're a big tent here. Mark Waller is the CMO of the NFL, came to sport out of the spirited world of spirits at Diageo, and is a very creative thinker, somebody I'm really looking forward to hearing from. Tim Brosnan is the Executive Vice President for Business at Major League Baseball, and will bring that perspective of a sport that is international but regionally important sport. Jim Tanner is a partner at Williams and Connolly and is part of a group that represents a very innovative way of representing athletes, including athletes who have come from abroad, Hito Turkoglu, and athletes who have succeeded in projecting themselves onto the international market. And Shane Battier, Adam Silver is the Deputy Commissioner of the NBA, and COO as well. And Jay Bilas is the ESPN college basketball analyst, among his many other roles. You're with
Moore Van Allen.
Moore Van Allen as well. And just a couple of points that I just wanted to do in introducing the topic. Sport has become this absolutely critical form of international cultural exchange. It is doing this in ways that are really quite unprecedented right now, providing a common language across many cultures. And this is really a very significant moment. The last thing I wanted to say is you'll note that there are no Duke faculty up here. We've talked about the Duke faculty being people who are quite central in sport. And this is actually deliberate. We've come here basically to New York and come to the people who are leading the industry to talk, to listen to them, not something law faculty are often accused of doing, but to listen and to generate the kind of base of information on which lawyers are going now to have to act and to make sense of, to think creatively about the kinds of issues that they're all facing. Thank you.
This is a really unique opportunity for us to start a conversation and to engage those out in the field and perhaps be able to find structural responses to what's going on. And Paul, thank you for putting this together. It's an extraordinary opportunity, I think, for all of us. And I wanted to start off with a question that was prompted by Paul, and that is, what is new? What are the opportunities that you see as being intriguing out in international markets right now for your leagues or the players that you represent or the interests that you represent, your stakeholders? And Mark, let's start with you.
Sure. What is new? Well, I think the first thing that's new for us as a group is actually looking at globalization and internationalization from an industry perspective, which I think is incredibly exciting. If you kind of look around the world at great consumer brands or great products and services, the majority of them are truly global. And increasingly their revenues, their consumer bases are coming from the global markets. And I think it's probably safe to say that sport as an industry has in some way lagged behind the trends and what other industries have done. So I think that's new. I think the concept that the focal point, the gravitational center of the world is changing after arguably 40, 60 years of where it's been centered around the US. I think that is evolving, and I think you're seeing that reflected in US sports looking to go outside. I think that's new. And obviously the environment that we live in, the digital environment, the way that news moves, the way that stories get told has changed dramatically and changes day to day. So for me, those would be kind of three
Just one follow-up. Why has sports lagged behind?
I think it goes a little to the point of the passion of the fan has been very domestically grounded. So when I grew up as a kid, my team was Scunthorpe United. It's a soccer team. The players used to work in the steel works, and the town met every Saturday at 3 o'clock, and they met to watch the 11 guys that worked in the factory play soccer. And that's where the passion came from. And then it became a regional idea, then it became a national idea, and now it's a global idea, and that's incredibly stimulating. But you also have to recognize that the passion driver is different. I went because 11 steelworkers were playing from my town. If you go and watch, I don't know, pick a team, Chelsea. I'm not sure if Chelsea at the moment even has an English player. That would have been unthinkable 20 years
or
ago.
an English owner.
Or an English owner. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. So the whole idea that a team, a sports team, represented your area was right when we all lived locally. It is only right and proper that as we now live globally, the teams and the sports that we have represent that global community, and that's, I think, what you're seeing.
Tim, how about from the baseball perspective?
Well, all of what Mark says is certainly true. What's new for us, actually, I started in the business. I got hired at baseball to work for the international business in 1991. But what's new for us is the pace at which our global growth, the pace at which our ownership is demanding that our business grow globally, the media that we get to use to facilitate that growth. And then for us, one particular development, and there's been kind of a confluence of factors, is in a way the shedding of the Olympics for us. Anyone who doesn't know, baseball has been effectively dropped from Olympic play. That creates an opportunity for us. We're unburdened by Olympic rules and regulations now, and this tournament that we dreamed up in 1992 called the World Baseball Classic has now had 2 executions, and really now without Olympic restrictions, our opportunity to grow what we think will be, the equivalent, and by the way, it will take quite some time, the equivalent of a soccer World Cup is terrifically exciting for our global growth.
Jim, how about from the player representation perspective?
Well, I think from the player's perspective, I've been doing this for the past 12 years now, and when I first started, as Paul alluded to, we represented Hito Turkoglu as a player who was leaving Turkey to come to the NBA, and I think the trend was that players overseas wanted to come and play in the NBA, and I still think that's obviously the case. I think we were at the forefront of something 2 years ago that was very different in that we were now seeing an American player in his prime leave the NBA to go overseas. We represented Josh Childress, who was a restricted free agent with the Atlanta Hawks, and he ended up signing with Olympiacos to a deal that was much more significant for him in terms of the compensation that it was paying him. But I guess broader than that is just the fact that it represented a completely different opportunity for him. Usually players that are leaving the NBA to go overseas were at the end of their careers or were players that weren't good enough to play in the NBA. This was the first time that somebody really who was very much wanted by the NBA and several NBA teams decided to go somewhere else. And so I just think that it presents a completely different dynamic, a completely different set of opportunities for players in the future. I don't know whether it's going to become a trend or whether they're going to be able to get the truly premier players to leave the NBA and go overseas, but I think it certainly gives us as players and agents for players another opportunity.
As a follow-up to the Josh Childress model, for lack of a better way of putting it, comment briefly on the Brandon Jennings, Jeremy Tyler model, where you have a high school kid who, instead of going into college, as is almost required now, goes overseas to pursue opportunities right out of high school. And in Tyler's case, he left after his junior year of high school to do it.
Well, I think, it's certainly, I think any player leaving the United States to go overseas, it's an individual circumstance, and it's not going to be right for everyone. When we were evaluating this for Josh Childress, it was clear that, he was a kid that had gone to Stanford. He was very much into international travel. After the end of every NBA season, he and his friends were going somewhere abroad to travel. So I think it took someone very unique to make that jump and to make that transition. In Jennings' case, I think, again, not every high schooler is going to be able to go over and adapt and succeed. And I think he actually struggled quite a bit when he was there, unlike the way he's playing now, and he's just playing fabulously. So, I think it's something that's going to be very individual. I don't think it's going to be something that you can say is going to be a trend or right for every player.
And for those who aren't familiar with Stanford, that's known as the Duke of the West, I'm told. Adam, what are the intriguing opportunities for you?
Jim said that Josh Childress was the first NBA player in his prime to leave and play overseas. I was just wondering, Jim, is there a second? Anyway, actually, what I'd say is happening for the first time overseas is sports marketing the way that we know it in the professional leagues in the United States, in the same way that a lot of what's happening in professional sports marketing is now trickling down to the college level. I'd say in China especially, some of you may have read this week, in fact, the NBA announced a naming rights deal for an arena that we're partners on with AEG, the company that's responsible for the Staples Center and other arenas in the United States. We and AEG developed a partnership, built the arena that the Olympics used in Beijing and also the Olympics in Shanghai, and we announced what I think is the first sports naming rights deal in China, which was Mercedes announced that they were going to have the naming rights for the Shanghai arena, and that was something until certainly the Olympics came and modern type sports marketing came to China, their culture was completely unfamiliar with. And I'd also say sports marketing, I mean, in addition to all the things these guys mentioned, of course, in terms of the impact of digital media, we're seeing that in Europe as well. If you go in a lot of the arenas, they're just beginning now. I mean, it may be for some of the people who are going to look at me and say it's terrible and all the things you've done to schmuck up sports in the United States you will now export to the rest of the world. But you're seeing in Europe where historically there wasn't a lot of, I love the word signage. I think it's made up. I don't think it's in the dictionary, but we use it in the sports industry. There's a lot of signage that you see in Madison Square Garden or any arena in the United States or in a lot of college arenas now. Up until fairly recently, and I've been with the NBA for almost 18 years, the buildings look like sort of Soviet-era buildings. There's just a lot of concrete, not a lot of signs, not a lot of advertising. And now you're seeing it in the same way that you see it in NBA arenas. You see the rotating signage, the courtside signs. You see sort of the upper deck, backlit advertising. I mean, it looks, frankly, a lot like being in an NBA arena. And I'd say now the culmination of that has been a new arena that AEG built in London called the O2 Arena. And if you sit in the O2 Arena and you watch a preseason NBA game, as I did this year, you could think you're in the Staples Center. There's virtually no difference. So I also think for the NBA in particular, what we're seeing on a global basis is the development of these so-called state-of-the-art arenas, the arenas that we're used to playing our games in, which creates enormous opportunities for us over time, because with those state-of-the-art arenas, we can develop the kind of revenue streams that we would need to support NBA-style basketball outside the United States.
To borrow Mark's phrase of passion driver, there are so many different passion drivers in sports, but I'm reminded that you all run businesses and make risk-reward analysis with each decision you make. So to talk about today's landscape, let me start with you, Adam, and ask you about 1992. In 1992, the NBA joined the Olympic movement. Talk about the strategy of doing that then and putting pros in the Olympics in basketball, and how that strategy may be changing now.
Well, I mean, 1992 is when I had first joined the NBA, and the strategy behind bringing NBA players then was that the feeling was from USA Basketball, which is technically a independent entity from the NBA, part of the USOC, the view was that professional players were participating for all other countries, they just weren't for the United States, and there was this enormous hypocrisy in who was defined as a so-called amateur athlete versus a professional athlete. And the feeling, and David Stern at the time went to FIBA, which is the global organization that oversees basketball, and said the rules no longer make sense, and let's standardize it for everybody, and every country should be able to send its best. So the theory behind the Dream Team was the United States should send its very best to compete, and you all know that story, and they were incredibly well received, and I think in many ways led to a boom in the growth of basketball on a global basis, in large part because of the popularity of those particular players who are participated. And then we got to a point in Athens, I guess then, where we lost. And so we had come full circle where we supposedly had sent our best there. Larry Brown was the coach, young LeBron and Carmelo were on the team, and a famous New York Knicks point guard participated as well, Stephon Marbury. And we came away without the gold medal. And I then participated in meetings that were attended by Mike Krzyzewski, your former coach, and led by Miles Brand, then head of the NCAA. And there was a lot of hand-wringing in the U.S. basketball community saying, how is it possible that we could be losing at our own game? What's happened to this program? And as a result of that, Jerry Colangelo, the former owner of the Phoenix Suns, stepped up and volunteered to run USA Basketball. Mike Krzyzewski said, I will, as a volunteer, coach that team. And I think largely, and it's hard for the NBA to take credit, I give those two gentlemen most of the credit, but they came to our top players and said, you need to do this for your country. And you have to think, and Jay could speak best to this, but from a basketball standpoint, playing at that level and playing year-round, takes years off your basketball body. There's no question about it. But they went to them and said, your country, there's something bigger than yourselves. This is bigger than playing for your NBA team. And I think to the credit of those players, and especially for the young players who had been in Athens when we had lost, the team became known as the Redeem Team. I mean, I think they wanted to redeem themselves and our country and demonstrate that we are the very best. I think that, and so they went, and of course, and they won the gold medal in Beijing, and for the most part, our top players played, and most of them have also commit, again, under Mike Krzyzewski, who's once again volunteered to coach, and Jerry Colangelo, that they would participate in London. The issue, as you began the question by saying, of course, we're all businessmen up here and have a bottom line responsibility to the shareholders of our league. The issue is, I'm not sure if that model is sustainable over time. I mean, Tim used the expression that they shed the Olympics. I mean, of course, baseball, we, the NBA, and USA basketball are still very much part of the Olympic model. But even for us, even though we, the USA team, won the gold medal in Beijing, we now need to qualify to play in London. So again, Coach K is taking his team to Istanbul, where the World Championships of basketball take place this summer, where the team needs to, again, qualify. And if they don't win there, then they have to play in a tournament next summer to qualify. And I think over time, it's going to become unrealistic to expect our very best players both to volunteer their time and for our owners who are paying these players, in some cases, well over $100 million to, in essence, participate for other profit-making entities, whether it be the IOC or NBC or GE or Comcast, whoever is going to be broadcasting those games. So I think it's something we think a lot about at the NBA, because I think those players want to participate. And by the way, the international players want to participate as well. I think in the last Olympics, I mean, everyone has to remember, it used to be in the old days that, and coming out of Barcelona, people said, why are these NBA players beating up on these, poor amateurs from these other countries? But on the medal stand for the 3 teams on the medal stand in China, 26 of the 36 players were NBA players. I mean, so the U.S. in the gold medal game against Spain, they were playing against other NBA players. Of course, Yao Ming was the leader of the Chinese team, an NBA player. Argentina was full of NBA players. But baseball may be onto something. I mean, over time, it may be, to the extent that you've created your own business through international competition, that's something that all leagues are going to have to look at.
Did I use the word shed related to the Olympics?
You did.
Since it's on camera and tape, I should be clear. Seriously, when I say shed, being part of the Olympic movement subjects you to a lot of stricture. In our case, mostly having to do with schedule. The breakdown between Major League Baseball and the International Olympic Committee was plain and simple about schedule. Their contention was, we want the best players just like the NBA provides. What they failed to recognize is that we have a 162-game season that occurs during the course of the Olympics. We play it over 180 days. And their simple solution, well, you should just shut down for 2 weeks, doesn't work for our economics. We tried many ways to craft a solution, because in truth, there is no greater worldwide marketing platform than the Olympic Games. There's just no argument about that right now. But we couldn't get it done, and our insistence in continuing to try and having under 25 teams and non-40-man roster teams and the like subjected us to strictures with different governing bodies within individual countries that kind of dictated what we could or couldn't do on the World Baseball Classic. Now, Adam was polite about the NBA's dilemma, but they have a real dilemma. At the very end of the day, what he sells and I sell and he sells is content that gets exploited in various forms. We happen to think, and maybe it's parochial, that we know how to exploit our content best. We like when third parties do it, but we like when they do it and pay us enormous sums of money to do it. It's plain and simple. So now in the growth of our game, and just to go back to international for a second, and why we're so excited about the World Baseball Classic. For baseball, the tried and true, and we've done it now for 15 or 18 years, the tried and true method to either increase penetration, meaning open up countries and territories that are not as baseball-centric or friendly as we'd like, or to increase frequency, to go to baseball countries that have some baseball heritage, and to get them to kind of repeat their behavior more and more. The tried and true for us is play, to play games, to put our stars in front of people on baseball fields and let them experience what we've known to kind of love at home. And again, when you're part of the Olympic movement, governing bodies have a lot to say about what you can or can't do at times of year with different players in uniforms that bear their names. They just do. So now with the World Baseball Classic and without an IOC, we have the ability to control our content, and we think we have the ability to replicate the secret of the Olympics or the World Cup soccer, and that is nationhood combined with athletic competition. There is no more powerful draw than those two. And we can now do it having shed Olympic restrictions.
Yeah, I think we're all wrestling, I think, with the same issue, which is everyone wants to see the best product, and they want to see it live. And we're blessed with the best athletic products in the world. I would argue the NFL better than anybody else, but I'm sure we'll all argue that. But that's what people want to see. And I think when we started out our international expedition, I think 94, the NFL kind of, we started out with what was known, I think, at the time euphemistically as the World League. And I think what we've learned is people now do not really want to see anything other than the best. So they want to see the Pittsburgh Steelers, they want to see Drew Brees, they want to see your guys play. And if we don't give them that product, they can get our content in many, many other ways. So it's up to us, I think, to find a solution. And I do think the whole area of governing bodies and how that comes together globally. I mean, every other industry that I've ever looked at some point realizes that if you want to work in a global community, you've got to find a global governing body or set of governing bodies that will help you navigate that. And I do think ultimately we're going to have to find our way, at least sport by sport, if not more broadly, through that.
Jim, you were going to say?
Well, I was going to add the player's perspective to this, which is, I think for the international players like the Hito Turkoglu's or the Zaza Pachulias, they have no choice other than to play. If they don't play, then their country has absolutely no shot of even, showing up and scoring points. And so they really, have a lot of pressure from their countries to play. For the domestic players, there's a little bit of a different analysis. Obviously, they have to decide whether or not they want to play for love of country, and that's generally what it comes down to. They want to play on behalf of the United States. But they have to weigh that against some of the other considerations, like if they're going into free agency, do they risk going over to play in these international competitions and risk hurting themselves in a way that might impact their contracts? The other thing is that if they play in international competition, it has an impact on their bodies, their abilities to come back and participate in the next season. Hito this year played international competition, and he had to skip pretty much all of training camp because he was so battered and bruised, having played, in the finals of the NBA and then going and playing international competition. So the players really have to make a determination as to whether or not it's worth it from their standpoint. They certainly don't get any monetary benefit from it, but they obviously get to support their countries, number one. And number two, I think it certainly adds to their branding and their exposure to do well in international competition.
Turkoglu and Pachulia may not have a choice as to playing for their national teams, but they do have a choice whether they play in the NBA. And what I find really fascinating is baseball and basketball have international competitors with different leagues around the world. Football really does. The NFL really doesn't. You have competitors in other sports that can take eyeballs away and have different content.
No, we're definitely, I think, in that respect, we're blessed. If we want to take on an international initiative, so if we decided that we wanted to play regular season games in London, all we need to do is put 32 owners in the room, have a chat about it, vote on it, and move it forward. We don't have to wrestle with any of the other governing bodies if we needed to break our season. So let's say we wanted to do more international games and we decided that instead of one bye week, we needed to have two to allow for more international travel, or we wanted to carve a week out of the season and play that whole week internationally. Those are all things that we can manage autonomously and independently. And to your shedding comment, we have nothing to shed.
Sorry, it's on tape.
But nor do you,
I can see the headline. I've done this before.
But nor do you compete for talent either, for international talent as much. Your talent is homegrown in the United States.
No, I think we all compete for athletic talent. So at some point, as kids grow up, great athletes will make a choice about where they're going to expend their talent. I would hope that as we do more and more internationally and Chinese people watch our game, I would hope that they will sit there and go, wow, that looks like an unbelievable product. And I've got a choice between the 300 million people who play in basketball in China, or I could potentially become the first ever NFL player. And I think there's a huge talent opportunity for us. It's different, definitely, but definitely we compete for talent.
We'll talk about the competition.
You know, Jim, don't say anything about concussions. No, but I would just say Jim said for our international players, they have no choice but to compete. I will say that, and you know, Mark, you could, as a soccer fan, can speak to this. It's a very different model for soccer or football outside the United States, and that is that they've elected their federation, FIFA, which is the equivalent of FIBA, has decided not to send their very best to the Olympics. In fact, it's 23 and under with a couple of exceptions now, largely as a business decision because they own the World Cup of football, of soccer, probably the biggest single sporting event in the world. So they said the very best are going to play in our tournament rather than the Olympic tournament. And the Olympic tournament is really, since it's 23 and under, is more of an exhibition in part. And I think where Tim is going, where baseball is going by creating their own, is closer to that model. So, Jim, I guess, if the federations, the national teams all got together, certainly we could make that decision. I mean, we, the global basketball community, that our world championships of basketball, which is not a very well-known event right now. I'd be surprised if many people in this room even knew it was taking place in Turkey this summer, but it's our equivalent of the World Cup, that we could turn that into a much bigger global tournament to the demise of the Olympics. Having said that, I mean, as Tim said, there's enormous marketing benefit to the NBA from the Olympics, and there has been, I mean, both because of the growth of basketball. Basketball has been an Olympic sport since 1936, and because of the growth of the NBA brand and the NBA players since 1992. So don't get me wrong. I mean, we the league, participate out of self-interest. I mean, the individual players, as Jim said, make their decisions. I will say, and often from economic terms, they're transferring the risk. As Jim said, God forbid a player participate if he's not under contract. So once he's under contract, he then transfers the risk to his NBA team, who either bears the risk that that player will be hobbled in some way, but they'll still be paying out on his contract, or if that player became disabled, the teams have insurance, but they're not able to get full insurance, especially for the top players, and often the deductible is roughly half the season. So that's sort of the business issue for the NBA owners right now. Is it worth it? I mean, it's clearly we've made the decision up till now, and certainly will be for London, that it's well worth it because we like to see our players play on the greatest stage in the Olympics, and there's enormous benefits to both the NBA and the game, but it is an issue we're going to have to keep looking at over time.
Tim, how do you balance, I mean, there's now an international labor pool for baseball, and has been for quite some time. How do you balance relationships that you have with other leagues around the world with your need to acquire the best talent from around the world?
Well, I mean, in the first instance, you don't. And so for a period of years, I think baseball kind of had its way with international talent. To the credit of both the current Major League Baseball administration and the professional leagues in Japan and Korea, people finally kind of said, okay, this is, being at war over talent doesn't help either of us. We want to grow baseball together. Having an underlying, a fight over players isn't healthy. So we developed a protocol system where there are professional leagues. And the idea is if there are other professional organizations that develop talent. Clearly, I don't think we want to get to the posting system that professional soccer has developed with FIFA, but we want to recognize people, organizations, if they develop talent, and compensate them for it. So there's a posting system in both Japan and Korea, the two most popular professional leagues outside of North America, whereby a club that's developed a talent can simply say, I'm going to make, and Japan still has a reserve system. 9 years you have to play under contract before you can have free agency in Japan. So if a club, before a player reaches free agency in Japan or Korea, wants to make him available, actually the player goes to the club and say, I'd like to opt out, I wish you would post me. Well, they post him, and basically you pay the club a bid, and they select from the highest bidder. And by the way, they have the ability to reject any bidder. They can decide that compensation wasn't sufficient, and we honor their reserve clause. But that's just with the professional leagues. The hot debate in baseball right now is over talent around the globe. It's over international talent in 100 countries. And we have a draft in North America and Puerto Rico only. And I think that, you know, in our search for talent, we want to be careful not to exploit talent where it's exploitable. And I think you'll see in the upcoming labor negotiations, a very hot topic is going to be the international draft. Because baseball would like to have, you know, as robust a talent pool worldwide as we could get. That benefits us. It benefits everybody in the baseball business. But at the very end of the day, we'd like it to be an organized distribution of that talent.
China. You, Adam, have had some significant experience with the complexities of dealing with international talent acquisition in China. One, Yao Ming. The other is Yi Jianlin a couple years ago. Can you address that and the experiences you've had and what you learned from that?
Sure. So the NBA, as a member of FIBA, agrees to respect contracts around the world through whatever league or federation. So at the time that the Houston Rockets drafted Yao Ming, he played in the CBA, the Chinese Basketball Association, and was a member of a team called the Shanghai Sharks. So under the FIBA rules, our team has to buy out his contract, and they're restricted, without going into all the provisions, largely because of our salary cap system. Our teams are limited in how much they can pay to buy a player out of his contract. Of course, a player is then free to pay the remainder of whatever the buyout is to get out of his own contract. In the case of Yao Ming, he in essence was employed by the government. In addition, and the Shanghai Sharks at the time were owned by the Shanghai Media Group. It controlled the largest media organization in Shanghai and was also a governmental entity. So in essence, in fact, at the time, I remember when the Houston Rockets selected him, some teams were, and maybe they were just jockeying for position, but some teams were putting out the word that that's a wasted pick on Yao Ming because you won't get him out of the country. And I don't ultimately know precisely what the deal is that Yao Ming did with whatever the governmental entities, but we know that some portion of his salary is paid to whatever municipalities in order for him to participate in the NBA. And it wasn't clear from the beginning that he would be permitted to leave to play in the United States. And ultimately, that the Chinese Basketball Association, in essence, the league there is joined with the national team, is also controlled by the CBA. And at the time, and I still think that the priority for Chinese basketball authorities is to create the best possible national team. So I think the feeling there at the time was it was more important that Yao leave the country and play against the very best competition in the NBA to put him in the best position to perform for his national team. And in effect, and in Beijing in the Olympics, the Chinese team made the medal round, which was a huge deal at the time. And in the case of Yi, who was drafted by the Milwaukee Bucks and now plays for New Jersey, it was touch and go in his case as well. And the Milwaukee Bucks are owned by Senator Herb Kohl from Wisconsin. And actually, he was under contract with the team in Guangzhou, which is the largest city in southern China. I think it was the Guangdong Tigers. And ultimately, Senator Kohl traveled to China to talk directly to the owner of that team to get permission for Yi Xinlian to come into the NBA. So each case seems to be somewhat sui generis so far. It's fairly labor intensive, and lots of lawyers have been involved in these transactions. But I think ultimately the reason these deals are happening, because certainly if the Chinese government decided it wasn't in their interest for their best players to play in the NBA, they wouldn't. I think right now the view is that they want their best players to come participate in the NBA, but also be available to play on the national team, which just lastly, I mean, raises an issue that both Jim and I have to deal with, because I think, frankly, at the end of the day, even if the NBA owners decided in order to enter into an NBA contract, you would not be permitted to play for your national team, which presumably is their right, we would lose players from certain countries. They'd say, you know, sorry, it's just the culture I'm from, or whoever the governmental entity that I'm responsible for insists that I play. And part of the deal is I have to be able to come home in the summer and play. We have an advantage, to Tim's point, in that the Olympics and the World Championships take place in the summer, so it doesn't interfere with our season. It doesn't mean it doesn't create all the other issues I talked about potential for injury and wear and tear, but at least there's a certain symmetry there, you know, in national competition and our league competition.
Jim, can you talk a little bit about Shane Battier, the unique case that he is? Limited marketing opportunities in the United States, but in China he has done extraordinarily well.
Well, I think Shane was very fortunate. He was traded to Houston, and it was at the same time that his shoe and apparel contract was expiring. He had a contract with Adidas. And so, you know, knowing that Yao was playing for the team, there was a company called Peak, which was a Chinese shoe and apparel company that had a very small sponsorship deal with the Rockets at the time. We started talking to them about the idea of Shane being their spokesperson in China. And so we were able to negotiate what was a remarkable deal for Shane, in that it was much more lucrative than what he would have gotten from the Adidases and the Nikes of the world. But it went beyond that. We looked at it more as a platform deal. And so it was a great deal in and of itself from the standpoint of the compensation. They were giving him a signature product line, so he's getting royalties on top of the guaranteed compensation. He was going to be featured in all types of marketing campaigns. They committed to support his marketing campaigns to the tune of $8 million annually. So they're putting him on billboards, they're filming commercials with him. We looked at it as a platform deal, so that if we could get as much exposure from this deal in China, then hopefully it would lead to other deals. The other thing that was interesting about that deal was that at the time, Peak was not an NBA sponsor. There was another company called Li Ning that was the NBA sponsor. So part of our analysis was whether or not we wanted to align him with a company that was not aligned with the NBA. And so we ultimately made the decision to do that. I think it's worked out. And long story short is that they're now an NBA sponsor and Li Ning is not. So I think it's an example of where we were able to benefit each other in a situation that really benefited the athlete, but also brought a new partner to the NBA.
Was that a singular happening, or do you think that's an opening that a lot of other players can take advantage of?
Well, I think they've signed quite a few players.
Are they?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, they're trying to expand. They only sell in China, but they've really used Yao and some of his teammates as a way to really expand their breadth and draw attention to their brand.
What are the prospects for each of your leagues for expansion, to have franchises in other countries that compete in your league beyond Canada?
Well, for Major League Baseball, again, because of the intensity of our season, 162 games in 180 days, Seattle almost exists as a foreign country because of the travel issues for them. I mean, if you think about playing for the Mariners, I believe you can travel 3 times more than an East Coast team. So aside from countries on the North American continent, and by the way, the stories about Mexico City, about Monterrey are true. They've had actual bids in, discussions with clubs when Major League teams have come for sale. This is just me. I think one of the difficult issues would be locating players and their families in places like that. I think that, you know, our players have a really, really strenuous 6 to 8 months. When they're home, they like the creature comforts of home. When their family, when they've left them on the road, they'd like to know that they're safe, secure, comfortable, taken care of, familiar with their surroundings. So for us, the markets that may be available, given the restrictions of our schedule, I think there are issues other than the schedule that may prohibit them. Someone will sometime explain to me why supersonic travel didn't work to Asia. Well, it didn't work to London, right? So how would it work to Asia? But I think in the future, if there was an opportunity for baseball, it would be to have a Pacific division of sorts, that clubs could go and spend an extended period of time playing against the Pacific Division, and then likewise, Pacific Division teams would come to North America and play against the North American teams for pockets of time and then go back. That's my guess.
Yeah, I guess ours is different. I mean, as we said before, we can structure our own season. We don't play that many games. That's one of the great appeals of our games, is every game counts. So we have the ability, I think, to structure the season differently. I think we've proven last year San Diego Chargers went and played in London and came back and had a very good and successful end to their season. So I think we've demonstrated that there is no real barrier to playing in a market like the UK or Spain or France or Germany. Obviously, time travel is different, is difficult. So from an NFL perspective, I'd be amazed if we didn't have a franchise outside of North America, and in North America I count Canada and Mexico, within the next 10 years. But the other thing, and I look back to when I was a kid, and it was unthinkable to me that there would be anything more important than what was at the time the First Division. And it was unthinkable to me that I wouldn't be listening to my music on a record player. And now we think nothing of going and playing in Europe in the middle of a season for a team that has the Super Bowl at stake, and that's not a big deal. And so I'm a firm believer that supersonic travel didn't work the first time. Most great innovations the first time kind of come in, they plateau, back off a bit, and then bounce back. I suspect we'll be supersonically traveling before too long. So very optimistic for the NFL, but optimistic for all of us, because I do think, and I come back to the point that Adam made, the polite one. We have the best products. We have the greatest athletes, and we take care of them very well. And if we can get those products on the world stage, and people in Beijing and Guangzhou and Bangalore and Rio de Janeiro can sit in a stadium and live what we have the privilege to live, they will love our sports more than they love soccer. So I am hugely optimistic for all of us.
Adam?
I think I got through, Mark, because last time it was like a collective we instead of we have the bet. But you know, I'm with Mark. I think it's possible. Don't mean to make news today, and Commissioner Stern has said it before that we think there's a real possibility in the next decade we could have NBA franchises in Europe. Historically, the issue has been, as I mentioned before, we didn't have state-of-the-art arenas. State-of-the-art arenas did not exist in Europe that could generate the kinds of revenues that were necessary to compete in the NBA. Now, in addition to the O2 facility in London built by AG, they also built a building that we've already played a preseason game in Berlin. And there is somewhat of a building boom going on in Europe in terms of arenas, because again, the arenas can be profitable on a standalone basis as opposed to stadiums that potentially have very few events. And our feeling is that once that arena infrastructure is in place, we can handle the logistics. We think, as Tim pointed out, I mean, flying from New York to Seattle, or, you know, we have teams in Miami, you know, Miami to Northwest United States. I don't know the exact distances, but, you know, flying from New York to London probably isn't that much further. And so if a team went over, and let's say we had a division in Europe of 4 teams, and it might not be a balanced schedule. I mean, we've looked at it, and in fact, we're exploring right now the opportunity to do something along the lines of what the NFL has done. We've only played, with the exception, opened our season with regular season games in Japan years and years ago. Tim and I used to both work on that. But what the NFL is doing is playing regular season games now in London, I guess. Mm-hmm. We've played lots of preseason games all over the world, virtually on every continent. We haven't played regular season games in Europe now, and it's something, given the London arena, that we're actually following the NFL and looking at whether, as an experiment, we can do that, and then trying to map out and understand that the schedule for us and for baseball, it's an incredibly tight schedule, and as Tim well knows, every single day on the calendar matters. And already, you know, they get heat for finishing so late. We're already backing up in the NBA at the end of June, and so if to the extent a team travels over there and you have to build in time for jet lag and they have to travel back. Although, you know, it's amazing. One thing, when we deal with our athletes and they play, you know, one game or so in Europe or Asia, if you look at golfers and tennis players, I mean, they do it all the time. You know, Serena Williams jumps on a plane, she plays in a tournament in Shanghai, she jumps on a plane, she comes back, you know, she plays in Miami 2 days later. I mean, athletes do it in a lot of other sports. So I think over time, you know, to Tim's point, they might not have all the same creature comforts, but also we have, of course, the union would have to agree to it, but I think if we were truly expanding and we were creating 40 new jobs, you know, it'd probably be a pretty good discussion to have with the Players Association.
Would it be a good time to open up for questions from the floor? If anyone has any questions for our panelists sitting out in the audience, I'm sure they would love to entertain them. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
I covered tennis a fair amount, but one question I always get, what happened to American tennis? The players now, I can't pronounce their names, and I can't follow the events, and the time changes mess me up. And as much as we're talking about globalization, I think, and here's an example where it hasn't necessarily been a force of good. Is there any trepidation, or is there any concern on your part that the fan who loves Peyton Manning might not, you might lose him if it's Barcelona playing Shanghai? I mean, is there any sense that this could be, there's a sort of Tower of Babel over it?
I can't answer for Peyton Manning because I haven't spoken to him about it, but I have spoken to Tom Brady, who went over to London and played. And Tom's answer was, if you want me to be an ambassador for this, I will do it, because this is the most stimulating, thrilling, opportunistic experience I've done in the last 10 years other than win Super Bowls. And I do think, I do think that the world is globalizing. And if we don't do that, we will ultimately lose out. And I think we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to the athletes that we represent. We have a responsibility to our fans. Our biggest debate in the last 3 years has been explaining to the fans of Buffalo how actually playing one game in Toronto makes that team more viable to stay in Buffalo. If they don't play that game in Toronto, the economics of that marketplace in the next 10 years would probably dictate that that team is not viable. So Toronto is actually allowing that team to stay and those fans to keep their team.
Yes, sir.
So, you know, obviously, soccer, if you look at soccer, you know, it's like it's one of the most popular sports around the world, really hasn't differentiated itself here in the States, aside from MLS. You have some, even the best players are still abroad. Are you confident that you can flip the tables? It sounds like clearly expansion is something that everyone's doing, but how confident are you that you can really make, you know, that football, for instance, the most popular sport in Asia, or basketball in Europe, when it's been soccer's been so entrenched for so long?
I can give you a very brief answer. These other guys have much more experience of you know, internationalization. Wherever we have played a game, a regular season game, we have surveyed the fans at the stadium directly. And in every single game, fans who have been rate the experience of our game higher than a Premier League experience, which is extraordinary. So for me, if fans enjoy it, more than the best product they got. It's like going into a market and where everyone drinks I don't know what, and you take them Coke and they go, yeah, that's a better product. So our job is get them more of the product that is better than the one they've got.
And I'd add in China, I think what you've seen in the last generation or so, a sea change in support for basketball versus soccer, where soccer, certainly 20 years ago, was head and shoulders above basketball. Based on a lot of the data we're looking at, we're roughly neck and neck with soccer in China right now. So I think it depends a large part. One of the reasons that all the leagues here market so heavily towards kids is it goes a long way to determining adults' fandom. And especially getting kids to participate in our sport. We know that if kids bounce balls instead of kicking balls, they're X times more likely to be fans of our game when they grow up. So we're seeing that it works. I mean, as I've said earlier, I mean, we're fortunate in that we basketball have been an Olympic sport since '36. So it's been played for a long time in those cultures. But I mean, even I've been at the NBA long enough now to see a direct result of our marketing in Europe and in China, and it really does make a difference. And sometimes even, in particular with basketball, part of sort of the pizzazz or whatever you want to call it, that's part of the culture of the NBA. It even, I think, and sometimes the kids are attracted to it in part because their parents aren't fans. And it's something new and it's something different. But so I think you can change over time. I would just say in terms of, I mean, the MLS, I would say, has quietly done a terrific job in the United States, but they, of course, don't necessarily represent, they would acknowledge as the best soccer in the world right now. And I think, as Mark said earlier, I mean, that's always one of the issues. American sports fans are very sophisticated and they want the very best. And then we'll see over time whether U.S. becomes part of a global market for soccer talent.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. The three different leagues and different teams, you all have different numbers of people on each team. Is there a concern with the globalization of evolution in talent? Is this the type of thing that you guys consider that if we add 4 more teams, 6 more teams, say in baseball, as opposed to maybe basketball that has a smaller team, then it's really going to be a different level of talent?
Well, actually, the globalization of our sport works the opposite way. We think that we're expanding the talent pool. Every single time that we go and play games in a country and introduce a whole new generation of kids to baseball, we've created an opportunity for ourselves for a whole new set of athletes to take up a stick and ball game when they otherwise, their only consideration was basketball or soccer. So for us, I think the consideration is quite the opposite. One of the primary reasons why we're pursuing international expansion as aggressively as we are is to develop talent, to make talent available both for here, because just like Mark said, we're biased. We think we own the most competitive form of the game in the world right now, and we have a hunger for talent. The flip side is we also want professional leagues to be that much stronger in their competition. So the more athletes we can introduce to baseball at the ages where they're making their competitive set choices, the better it is for baseball.
Yes, sir.
What issue does what I would call the image problem that some of the leagues have experienced at various times, whether it be drugs or violence, things of that nature, how do they play into some of the more conservative cultures throughout the world?
Next question. At the end of the day, I don't think it's so different than it is in the United States. You're right. We deal with issues all the time in all of those categories that you mentioned. And I find where the greatest differences are generational. And especially the NBA has it because we have a particularly young appeal. And sometimes, almost by definition, like take tattoos, for example. I mean, that's not a problem. I mean, but our guys are heavily tattooed, and where that becomes maybe very culturally hip for a certain generation becomes a real turnoff for an older generation. And I find outside the United States, I mean, different cultural mores, different cultural taste. But I think for the most part, people are more similar than dissimilar in terms of players who do bad things, you know, they frown on. And I think, I would say, also this goes a little bit to the dilution question as well. I mean, we have 83 international players on our, we had 83 international players on our opening rosters this season, you know, roughly 20% of our workforce, and they also represent some of the very best players in the league as well. I mean, we think about dilution. I mean, you can only expand so much, but to Tim's point, we're now looking at a global pool of talent. I mean, when you open up China, I mean, who thinks that, you know, Yao Ming is the last great player to come out of China as opposed to the first great player to come out of China? And you go, for those of you who travel now to China, you go to Beijing or Shanghai, it looks like New York City. When you walk down the streets, there's playgrounds and all the kids are playing basketball. So it would almost seem just inevitably other great players, you know, if you take Dirk Nowitzki from Germany or Pau Gasol from Spain or Tony Parker from France, and those kids are turning on, those players are turning on a whole new generation of kids who see them as their role models. And you go to those markets and you, just like Shane Battier in China, you see their images everywhere. You see their billboards, you see them advertising all kinds of products. So I think, you know, what I guess my real point in terms of the cultural issues is that I do think those players feel a tremendous responsibility to their culture when they're in the NBA. I mean, to be even that much better in terms of their off-the-court conduct. Because, I mean, Yao Ming in particular, you can almost feel it sometimes when you're around him, that he has the pressure of a population of 1.3 billion on him, that if he screws up in the NBA, it's a major black mark for his country. And I think it's true for a lot of players who come from other nations to play in the NBA.
Yes, sir.
The way international play or the way international development works for us is quite simple. We partnered with the Players Association 2 or 3 collective bargaining agreements ago. And so basically, we adopt a business plan together, and it is in the players' interest to expand as rapidly and aggressively as they can because they share in the proceeds. You know, I should go back to the World Baseball Classic because it's a perfect example. The Players Association is Major League Baseball's partner in the World Baseball Classic. The third partner in the World Baseball Classic is the International Baseball Federations. You know, Mark said, and he's quite correct, when he stated that there does need to be, as we grow internationally, there is going to have to be certain governing bodies. There has to be an organizing committee, someone who sets stricture. With us losing the Olympics, our need to continue to support the International Baseball Federation has gotten even greater because we need their arms and legs on the ground to keep baseball active, and B, they need our financial support to continue the development activities that they do. So your question was about collective bargaining. We share our international proceeds with our Players Association. I don't see that changing in any collective bargaining agreement going forward. But as part of our international plan, our business plan, a considerable amount of monies is going to go to development country by country with governing bodies that we otherwise don't have a lot of association with.
Well, let us thank the panel. We can continue